So a couple of months ago, I looked at the fact that Lucee CMFL implements ReturnType on the CFQuery tag, which allows us to return the underlying result set as different data structures within the ColdFusion runtime. Previously, I looked at the fact that you can return an array, and I wanted to follow up now a couple months later with the fact that you can actually return a struct as well. And when you return a struct, you have to provide it with a key to use as the lookup value on that particular struct. So in this case, we're going to be looking for club memberships that have a user ID and a club ID value, and we're going to group by the user ID. So essentially we're going to get the number of clubs that each particular user is a member of, and we're going to turn that as a struct keyed on the user ID. So this is going to return a struct where the key is the user ID and the value is the row which has the user ID and the club count. So let's just run this and see what happens. So here you can see we're getting their query as a struct, and the user ID, 25 in this case, is the lookup key, right? 27 is the lookup key, 28 is the lookup key, and so on and so forth. And what this allows us to do is now access a particular record based on a column value within that record. Now, you'll see here in the dump I'm appending this result, and I'm just doing that to get rid of some of the query metadata. And if we remove that, right, we get a little bit more metadata. So you can see this is being generated from the query. Now the thing that's not necessarily obvious here is that the struct is an ordered struct, which means that the iteration of the struct is going to match the underlying order. So for example, if we come in here and we order by user ID descending, what you'll see is now the iteration of this struct matches that order by ID descending, which is just kind of a cool little feature of ordered structs within ColdFusion, or I should say within Lucee in this case. Now, how would I use something like this? Well, oftentimes in my application code, I will move things like inner joins and subqueries out of the database and into the application layer, particularly when I only need to get a subset of data based on a previously derived data set. So what we're going to do in this case is we're going to get a bunch of users from the database, and then we're going to get the club counts for each one of those users. So the number of clubs that a particular user is a member of. And then we're just going to iterate over this, look at the club counts in that return struct, and output the value. So let's take a look at how this is happening. So if we jump down to the get users, you can see I'm just grabbing the ID and the name for a particular set of users. And if we now jump down to the club count, you can see this accepts that array of user IDs, right? So we took that returning users query, plucked out the ID values, and we're passing that array of user IDs now into the club count index. And you can see that the club count index is going to be using the ReturnType struct on that CFQuery. We're going to be using the user ID as the lookup value, which we just saw on the previous page, right? And we're going to be passing in the array of user IDs as a ways to narrow down the results. So this is going to return, again, a struct in which each one of these records is indexed by a user ID, and then we can essentially get the club count based on that user ID, which again is what we're doing here. We're looking at the club count struct. We're using the user ID as the lookup key. Now, that query is only going to return users that actually have a club membership. So users that don't have a club membership won't be in this struct, which is why we're using the safe navigation operator, which will allow us to reference the club count struct property without throwing a null reference error. And of course, the safe navigation operator will bail out if there is no user ID lookup key, in which case we're going to be using the Elvis operator to default to 0. And now the rest of the logic is fairly straightforward. If there is a non-zero count, we output how many clubs the user was part of, and if the count is 0, we see that they haven't joined any clubs. If we run this code, you can see we can see that Sarah and Bianca have not joined clubs, but Branch and Stephen and Ronan and the others have joined at least one more club. So using the ReturnType struct here, definitely useful when you want to move something like a subquery, right? I could have just as easily had this type of value or this type of information in my lookup as a subquery, right? But sometimes you don't always want to do that. Sometimes there is a benefit to keeping your database queries simple, especially when you don't necessarily need to get the subquery data for all records in the previous set. And it's really nice to see that Lucee CFML will make that easier and almost certainly faster than how I would have done it, because they're going to be doing it in the Java layer, not the Cold Fusion layer. So pretty cool feature, and probably something I'll be able to leverage going forward.